Hello, welcome to episode 8 of Scuttlebutt, a Marine Corps Association podcast. And today we're taking a deep dive and introducing a new concept, amphibiosity. I'm Nick. I'm here with Vic.
Hey.
Will.
Howdy.
And special guest, the man, the myth, the legend, Col Chris Woodbridge.
Hi there.
Amphibiosity. Vic.
Yeah, so don't bother Googling it. And if you type it into a Word doc, you're going to get the red squigglies because it's sort of a word I made up. Me and a few of my Amtracker buddies. The genesis behind this series is when I was a young, spry Marine officer. Obviously, being around other Marine officers, you talk about, Marine type stuff. And one of the really sort of engaging questions we had was, what does it really mean to be that the Marine Corps is an amphibious service? And many discussions ensued, and it obviously as an Amtracker, it was very, it related very much to what we did on a daily basis. And, of my 20 years in the Marine Corps, 12 of them were spent outside of Amtraks and very much land-based and landlocked. And so it just became more and more of an actual question rather than just something to talk about while putting down some brews. And so as I've been here with the Marine Corps Gazette, I've seen many articles that are sort of touching on these things. There's, if you had a Venn diagram, there's a lot of layover. And obviously, as we have been unpacking Force Design 2030, and we're talking about divesting, investing, these sorts of questions became more and more germane to what is the Commandant's vision, and then what does it mean to be soldiers from the sea. And so then I got to talking with Colonel Woodbridge, and we just felt like there was a leveling exercise that needed to occur. And, this being Scuttlebutt, we wanted to sort of take these discussions outside of the realm of Scuttlebutt, take it outside of the smoke pit, take it outside of the bar, and actually start to unpack, what is an amphibious force? What is a 911 force?
Yes, why was the Marine Corps in the landlocked country of Afghanistan? Right?
Landlocked in Iraq, landlocked in Afghanistan. For the past 12 plus years, we, MUs have been doing all of the great things, the expeditionary force and readiness, but what do? They get off their ship, and then they go to a FOB, and then they operate in country, and then they do this huge road march back to the port and then get back on the ship. And so they spend the bulk of their time on forward deployed, landlocked. So, we just really wanted to get into these discussions and wanted to engage you, the listener. And we, as always, love feedback, in whichever way. But hopefully this just helps be a part or be a facet of the discussion that I think many Marines, retired and still in uniform, are having about what does it mean to be amphibious. And so, some of these concepts that we'll unpack in this episode, I think, are is there such a thing as a service-defining capability? When Colonel Woodbridge and I were both at CD&I, this was a reoccurring theme and something that had to be unpacked and defined and redefined over and over again, because we as Marines in the realm of Scuttlebutt love to hang our hats on this idea of a service-defining capability. And so is there one? What would that, if there is, would that be for the Marine Corps? If there isn't, then what is it that defines us as a service separate from the other services? Another question that we'll look to unpack in the series is, does it even matter that we're amphibious? Or is our contribution to the joint force value added without ships.
All right.
I know ACMAC spoke at length about L-class shipping, so clearly it's something that senior leadership finds important, but is it?
All right.
Or does it need to be? Another question we'll unpack is EABO amphibious? Or is it just fixed site on an island? What is forcible entry from the sea? What does it mean to provide forces that can conduct forcible entry from the sea? And are we even still in that business? Is area denial the same as forcible entry? And then, what does it mean to project power forward from sea basing? Is sea basing expeditionary? And then at the, sort of one thing that we'll unpack, especially as we bring some acquisitions specialists in here, is like, are we then procuring systems that enable O-plans that may or may not have amphibious operations incorporated into it? And obviously that's high side stuff, but we'll talk about a lot of these things in more general terms so that it's accessible, not just from a vocabulary standpoint, but also from a class clearance standpoint as well. So
Yes, absolutely. And it's, well, as we can clearly tell, it's a many-layered situation.
yeah, this is an onion for sure.
This is, or a parfait.
Or a tiramisu.
Or a tiramisu. or just a 7-layer dip.
Yes. There's your California roots coming out there.
There we go.
And,
All right.
sorry, and every question we asked is open-ended. So again, any of our listeners out there are writers or aspiring or writing your thesis or such, here's a good question for you to answer.
And some of the stuff has already been kind of popping up on the Gazette blog, mcamarines.org/blog. You can find it there. All voices welcome. And to help start peeling back some of the layers or start dipping our tortilla chips
in, yeah.
into our 7-layer bean dip, we have Colonel Woody Woodbridge here. I think colloquially we refer to the man, the myth, the legend himself as Woody around these parts. He doesn't really need an introduction, but we're going to give him one right now. He is the editor-in-chief at Gazette magazine. And I would like, I'm going to just leave this to you,
Right.
Woody. To,
Infantry, Marine,
yeah.
commander at all levels.
Why don't you let me drive?
Yeah.
We're gonna step back. Let's hear this one out.
So my nickname, and I'm an infantry Marine, so it's just a nickname. It's not a call sign. Is Woody, just like everyone in my family, with the last name Woodbridge. Even my mom winds up being called Woody. There are a lot of Woodies in the Marine Corps, but they're all secondary to me. I was an 30-year Marine infantry officer by trade. I was very, very fortunate throughout my career that I was either stationed somewhere in 1st Marine Division, 1st Marines or 7th Marines, mostly. So leading Marines out in California, deploying operationally, training for those deployments, recovering afterwards, all those infantry type things. And then the other approximately half of my career was spent somewhere around Quantico, Northern Virginia, and I'll include the Hampton Roads area in that in various roles as a teacher, an instructor, a trainer, a school director. I was the director of the School of Advanced Warfighting, which is the advanced intermediate level school for majors that spends an awful lot of time in seminar and readings and research, unpacking issues exactly like we're going to be talking about this morning. And I've also spent a significant amount of time as a trainer, staff trainer, both on the staff of the MAGTAF staff training program and as the chief of joint training in the now defunct Joint Forces Command down at the Joint Warfighting Center in Suffolk, Virginia. So in those roles, I've supported training for exercises that essentially train staffs in capabilities particularly those capabilities that are too complex or too expensive to train with live training exercises. And so since really the early 1990s, the Marine Corps and all the Joint Forces have migrated towards the use of computer-based simulated, so constructive environment war games in order to do staff training for large formation exercises, to include large formation amphibious and expeditionary exercises that are just too costly to do live. However, I'll point out that as a young officer, as a lieutenant in the late 1980s, we still did live, large-scale, meaning Marine Expeditionary Brigade and Marine Expeditionary Force level exercises with troops in the field. And from that perspective, as lieutenant platoon commander, doing those sorts to include two amphibious MEB field exercises on ship, using, frankly, more ships than are available in the West Coast inventory in total today for a 3-week training exercise. We did all that live, and I can tell you from the platoon commander perspective, it was a phenomenal experience, but also a tremendous waste of the platoon's time, because at that level of exercise, a rifle platoon or a heavy machine guns platoon or a reconnaissance platoon is a tiny pawn on a giant chessboard, and thus the use of computer simulation in our modern training is so much more efficient and effective for training those large-scale exercises. The reason I bring that up is because, since we're on the subject of amphibiosity, and I've got to say it's a great word that doesn't exist.
Thank you.
It truly doesn't exist, but it's one of those words, made-up words, that is a signature of the Marine Corps, perhaps second only to MAGTAFFERY.
McTaffrey, sir.
And so, what in the world does that mean? I would say that for our, essentially anyone in the Marine Corps now, below the rank of Brigadier General, Master Gunnery Sergeant, Sergeant Major, CWO5, some older colonels, of which I was one. The sole experience of amphibiosity are MEU deployments. And that's a legitimate experience, but it's so narrow in scope that it really doesn't, to use the word, unpack these issues of amphibious operations and what may or may not be a service-defining capability. So that's a little bit of my background. I've been the Gazette editor for going on 6 years now, and in that role I get to read everybody's term papers, and an awful lot of those term papers over the last 2 to 3 years have been getting after these sorts of issues from a variety of different perspectives. With that, let's dive into this.
Absolutely, sir. Well, sir, thank you for being with us and being generous with your time. So, Layout, let's kick it off. Service-defining capability, sir. What is it?
Again, that's a made-up term, but it gets thrown around quite a bit. It's in some ways. So the first thing you have to do is really examine which meaning of capability is the relevant one for the discussion that phrase is being used in. A capability can be used to define or to explain a broad set of activities, functions, and operational small c capability that a service possesses. And so then the service-defining capability, looking across the armed forces, becomes sort of a strategic messaging code phrase that talks to what is better defined as the role or mission of that armed service. And some of them are very clear. All of this discussion of quote-unquote roles and missions, and those terms get used interchangeably in this discussion, dates back to 1947, immediately following World War II and the Key West Conference. Then later, 1949, the Defense Reorganization Act, and then follow-on legislation in 1956 and 1958. The Marine Corps did not achieve the status of that legislatively defined role and mission until the late 50s. Some of them are very simple. The Army, their role is land warfare, period, full stop. Subordinate to that, the Army's role also involves mobilization of the country, of the United States of America, in time of major or total war. So there's a strategic underpinning of everything that the Army does. The last time that occurred really was World War II. And so looking at that model, everyone in the United States was in the Army in World War II, essentially. The Navy, it's sea warfare. And everything that defines in terms of the dimensions of sea space. So subsurface, surface, the air above sea space, which is one of the reasons why the Navy is allowed legislatively to have its own Air Force. The Air Force's role legislatively is strategic air power. They are their commonly used tagline is the strategic arm of decision. And so much of that relates back again to the late 40s up through the late 50s and the emergence of the nuclear triad. So the Strategic Bomber Command at the time and the Strategic Missile Command of the time were part of the nuclear triad that ensured the survival of our nation during the great power competition of the Cold War. Lots of cool old terms there: mutual assured destruction, first strike, offensive capability, all those things. And it is Wednesday, but it is Throwback Thursday because we're starting to use those same terms again in relation to emergent capabilities, strategic missile capabilities in the People's Republic
Well,
of
hopefully
China.
they don't dust off the doomsday clock that they used to have back then.
Or people need to start watching Dr. Strangelove again. Because that's probably the most significant strategic work of the period. And so, when you come now around to the Marine Corps as a service, what is the Marine Corps' role or mission? And as defined legislatively, we are charged to provide a balanced air-ground striking force, so an expeditionary striking force, up to a division's worth of ground troops, up to a wing's worth of aviation times 2. That's the Marine Corps' role. So to look at a service-defining capability, now you get over into what I'll call the other capital C capability definition. And that really becomes code for material solutions and equipment. All right? And so in order to have the broad capability of an amphibious operation, there are material requirements necessary in order to do that. And some of this is, for want of a better term, a vocabulary drill. And it's important to get to that vocabulary, what the ground truth terminology means. Many have often said that one of the true marks of a military professional is the precise use of precise terminology. And so, yes, there are plain language definitions, plain English definitions, but the definitions that count, if you will, are those accepted doctrinal definitions of these terms. So when we talk about an amphibious capability or an amphibious operation, right, that really means a military operation launched from the sea by an amphibious force to conduct landing force operations in the littorals. That's the definition of an amphibious operation. And there's as in every military doctrinal definition, there's a bunch of lesser included offenses in there. So in order to really understand that definition, first, what do we mean by an amphibious force? All right. Well, an amphibious force is defined as an amphibious task force, which is a collection of ships to include amphibious ships, ships with well decks, ships with flight decks, ships with troop berthing for embarked Marines, and storage for their equipment and ammunition. Oh, by the way, those amphibious ships also have command and control capabilities, particularly aviation command and control. So the command and control of aircraft and missiles from the sea, and on a gray bottom combatant amphibious vessel. The other part of an amphibious force is the landing force. That's those embarked Marines and the means that get them from ship to shore to operate in the littorals. They are the landing force. They, in an amphibious operation, they conduct landing force operations in the littorals. Okay, how do we define the littorals? And that is a what I'll call a squishy definition, because the littorals are bounded by your capability to project power from the sea base. So there's almost a little bit of a logical loop there, but essentially the littorals are how the landing force, the amphibious task force, define them. We go this far and no farther. We also acknowledge transitions of command and control during an amphibious operation. In the early phases, the commander of the amphibious task force is in charge. And one of the main reasons that leader, that commander, is in charge, again, is because the means of commands and control are on ships. As the landing force goes ashore, there is an expectation that command and control phases ashore. And this is one of the areas where having mu amphibious experience really doesn't cut it as far as understanding the breadth and depth of large-scale amphibious operations. Until and unless command and control of aircraft and missiles, so aviation or air command and control, phases from ship to shore, then command and control really has not phased ashore, and the commander of the landing force never really takes command of the entire amphibious operation. We have not done that in the context of an amphibious operation, really, since Korea, in terms of an opposed amphibious operation, and certainly, and I'll talk a little bit about the types of amphibious operations, kind of a different view on that. We have taken the capabilities to do aviation command and control ashore. We've transported them on ships and taken them ashore, but more often they are a fly-in asset. Often flying not from a sea base or an amphibious base, but flying from the continental United States or from a U.S. base overseas, and in reality, almost always from a combination of both. Because the limiting factor in aviation command and control is the ability to establish the radars and communication nets that permit you to command and control aircraft in the Tactical Air Command Center, ATAC Center. There is only enough equipment in the Marine Corps to put 3 of those up at one time, and really there's shortages for that. We don't want to get into any classified information, but the fact is, in order to have aviation command and control established in Iraq and Afghanistan at various points in the last 10 years, it took a global sourced effort from the entire Marine Corps and limited our ability to do that sort of command and control anywhere else in the world.
And so, sir, just to, I guess, play it out to give examples. So, say the 22nd MEU shows up in Kuwait. What you're saying is that transition of command and control only really happens. It's not a phased. It happens abruptly, and it's not complete. Because once the 22nd MEU shows up in Kuwait, the Marines get off port, load up on tactical vehicles. Now the landing force commander has it, but he doesn't have the air. He really doesn't have he's really just doing TMC, tactical movement control, from Kuwait to, say, Qaidam or Al-Assad or wherever, and then he's then being absorbed into that ground commander, that regimental task force's O plan, and then he does that for 2 months. Then he comes back, and then transfer of authority, if you will, then goes back to the ship as they embark back. And then once they pull out of Kuwait, now the Navy commander is back in control. Is that kind of what you're saying?
That's a good thumbnail. The one thing, and using the Iraq example, the one thing that's missing is that there, in that example, there is or was attack center, a Marine Aviation Command and Control. In this case, our Iraq example, at Al-Assad, but it didn't come off ships.
Right.
It didn't phase ashore. It was established there,
And they were
and it stayed there.
They were basically DS to the regimental task force.
No, that's
Or-
not a fair.
okay.
That's not a fair statement. They were the command center of the aviation combat element of Multinational Force
yes,
West.
yes, okay.
So the MEF, the Marine Expeditionary Force equivalent command in Iraq, was known as MNF West, or Multinational Force West. Its aviation combat element rotated amongst Marine wing headquarters, MAW headquarters, but the hardware, software, workstations, most importantly, radar and communication systems stayed in place as the people
Yes.
rotate through. So again, let's talk a couple more terms here. What we're really talking about there is sustained operations ashore.
Yep.
All right, and as we pointed out earlier, in a ground warfare scenario. So not surprisingly, the higher headquarters that these Marine forces are falling under are Army headquarters, who assume the role of combined joint task forces or joint task forces. And so, again, that experience and this experience of the last 20 years really does not reinforce our amphibious service-defining capability or our amphibious role. It does, on the other hand, reinforce two things. First is, again, going back to a formal definition, the definition of expeditionary operations. So it's one of these, some amphibious operations are expeditionary operations, some expeditionary operations are amphibious operations, but it's like a Venn diagram.
And people just throw that term around.
That's right, but
It's just-
expeditionary operations are defined as a military invasion of foreign territory, usually away from established bases. So, in other words, you're not just hopping from the United States to some place, or from
Stuttgart or
Okinawa
something.
or Stuttgart to some place. You are outside base support, installation support of United States forces. So that's important. Because that's what the Marine Corps did from 2002, 2001, really in Afghanistan on. It's what the Marine Corps has been doing starting in 2001 in the Horn of Africa. So that certainly reinforces our value to the Joint Force in expeditionary operations. The other thing that it does, and this is again not a doctrinal term, but it demonstrates the relevance of Marine forces. The simple fact of life is, if there is an extended major operational commitment of U.S. forces, and one or more of the services is not involved in that operation, they lose relevance. Obviously, in a major land campaign, the Army, most relevant. The Marine Corps also does ground operations as a
Clearly.
MAGTF and has to maintain relevance. So, the question of, why were Marines in Iraq and Afghanistan? Because they have to be. They have to be. Not because it's important to the Marine Corps, but because they are a part of the nation's force structure. They are allocated and assigned to regional combatant commanders, geographic combatant commanders, for those purposes. They support those concept plans, operations plans, and operations orders. So one other nuance here, and this is non-doctrinal. This is sort of the critical thinking or saw seminar way of thinking about these things. So we know from studying history that amphibious operations, and really modern amphibious operations, trace their roots back to Allied efforts on the Gallipoli Peninsula in World War I. A combined force of British, Commonwealth, Australian, New Zealand, colonial, Indian, and French forces landing on the Gallipoli Peninsula to take that piece of ground in order to permit Allied ships to go up the Dardanelles and assault or bombard with naval gunfire Istanbul as a way to keep the Turkey, from supporting their German allies and Austro-Hungarian allies on the Western Front. So strategic picture there, operational picture, open the straits, take the mines out, take the naval guns so that Allied ships can get up and create a problem for the Turks. Tactically, an amphibious operation on the Gallipoli Peninsula. Taught a lot of lessons across all the Allied and other armed forces after World War I. Some took the lesson away that amphibious operations are just too complex, too difficult, and must be avoided at all cost. In the United States, for primarily the Marine Corps, but also the United States Army, looked at the after-action reports, if you will, and said, no, this can serve as a template. If you fix this, if you do this differently, if you develop these material capabilities, amphibious ships, landing craft, aircraft, you can use amphibious operations. You can do that military operation launch from the sea base. But from a critical thinking perspective, why do you do that? What makes it of value? And again, as an opinion, I think it falls into one of three categories. And as you look at the historical background and record of amphibious operations, things tend to align into these three categories. First is necessity. There's no other way to get forces there. Islands in the Pacific in World War II. There's really no other way to get on an island, particularly an island isolated by thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean, other than to come from the sea. Put forces on amphibious ships, sail them with other ships, conduct an amphibious landing or assault on that island in order to secure that island, always for some higher purpose. Normally because of an airfield, which then extends your bomber and fighter cover reach as you start to close in on your adversary, in this case the Japanese Empire. So there's necessity. There's also convenience. And I would submit that the majority of MU operations from the 1980s on conducted amphibious offloads, often in the auspices of an amphibious landing or assault, for convenience. Your equipment is on naval ships. You're in the area. You're going to do training or an operation in a given country, and it's the best way to get there. So it's convenient. I would say that in many ways, Marine operations in Vietnam, from the initial landings at Da Nang, again, it was an offload of convenience. Some of that also went on in the intervening years between Desert Shield and Desert Storm in the North Arabian Gulf, and certainly then happened again multiple times during the course of Operation Enduring Freedom, or Iraqi Freedom. With regard to operations in Afghanistan, that was a true amphibious assault and record-setting in many ways, not least of which being the distance traveled inland.
Right.
And then finally, the last category of why an amphibious operation, again, from sort of the plain English critical thinking perspective, is because it's tactically sound, because it creates an advantage against an adversary that they cannot account for, and that does all the good maneuver warfare tenets in terms of the results on that enemy system. All right, you create a problem the enemy can't solve. You put the enemy in a dilemma that they're unable to extricate themselves from. Their ability to command and control themselves and sustain forces against you starts to erode and go away. Prime examples. The Marine prime example is Incheon in 1950 during the Korean War. So essentially doing an amphibious envelopment to get around and behind to a less defended flank of an enemy, a ground-based enemy, cut their lines of communication, isolate them, and then defeat them in detail. That's a tactically sound operation.
And using the sea as maneuver space,
Precisely.
which almost by definition is not.
Correct.
It's
exactly.
an obstacle.
Yeah, there's not a lot of nations that can do
most people's
That's exactly
sea
right.
maneuvers. Yeah.
most people's McCoo, the sea is
Can't go there.
crossed out.
Can't go there. Again, because of a lack of capital C capabilities. My personal favorite example of that use of the sea as maneuver space is not a Marine example. It's an Army example from fairly early in World War II. And it is what, at the time, Lieutenant General Patton did during the Allied assault on Sicily. Landings occurred on the south shore of Sicily, which is a roughly triangular island. In the upper right or northeast corner is the Messina crossing into the boot of Italy. Combined Allied, so British and U.S. forces land on the south. The British forces take the most direct route south and then northeast up to Messina. The American forces clear the west and north sides of the island, and during the course of doing that, Patton and his division conducted a series of 3 amphibious envelopments on German forces along defending that stretch of north shore of Sicily to close on Messina. They had the landing craft. They were not inordinately complex envelopments because they did not involve getting back on ship. So there was no amphibious withdrawal or recovery involved. But with the landing craft, with the forces, put them on the landing craft, take them out to sea.
Shore-to-shore maneuver.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So shore-to-shore maneuver, again, but using the sea as maneuver space and getting behind and on the flank of a defending enemy, cutting them off, cutting their access of retreat. And in terms of defeat mechanisms, that is one of the most effective tactically. When the enemy loses the option of retreating, then they have only 2 choices: die in place or surrender, and most opt for surrender at that point. So those are sort of the why amphib things. But again, all of it boils down to having the ability, the capability, capital C, to use the sea as maneuver space. And that's how we get to kind of the modern dilemmas about amphibiosity. So for many years, we have focused our amphibious requirements. So what does the Marine Corps need as a Marine Corps? What does the Marine Corps need from the United States Navy? What does the Marine Corps need from the Joint Force in order to do what? Well, that what is the amphibious requirement. And for many years, it was expressed as a joint forcible entry operation requirement. The term JFAO gets used. Again, sometimes interchangeably with an amphibious operation. But again, some joint forcible entry operations are amphibious, but not all are. The one that's relevant here was often referred to as the 2 MEB JFAO. So the Marine Corps has to be able to organize, train, equip, and provide 2 Marine Expeditionary Brigades, and the Navy has to provide the amphibious ships and landing craft for those 2 Marine Expeditionary Brigades to conduct an amphibious assault.
On potentially different shores.
Correct.
Yep.
Either together or on different objectives.
Objectives, yes, sir.
But looking at the definition of a joint forcible entry operation, the seizure and holding of a military lodgment in the face of armed opposition or forcing access into a denied area to allow movement and maneuver. All right, that is, again, a part of that expeditionary invasion, military invasion of foreign territory. And clearly, amphibious isn't the only way that you can do that. We have Army entire divisions based on conducting joint forcible entry operations from the air, with the United States Air Force providing their transportation and movement and maneuver. But for the Marine Corps, organizing, training, equipping, and providing a combatant commander with 2 Marine Expeditionary Brigades has been the chalk mark on the wall for a generation or more. And so what we've discovered is, or what we learned along the way is, again, like all of these joint definitions, there are lesser included offenses. What do we really mean by a Marine Expeditionary Brigade? How many regiments or regimental landing teams are in that brigade? How many battalions are in each individual landing team? Why is that important? Well, because that eventually gets translated by the Navy into how much amphibious ship capability is required.
Boat spaces.
Correct. Boat spaces, landing craft, well deck spaces, flight deck spaces.
Yep, how big is
all
the
of
ace?
that.
Yep.
Exactly. So within that also, details. Within that landing force, regimental combat team, regimental landing team, how many battalions are going ashore using surface means, those AAV P7 Alpha 1s that Vic loves so much.
Right.
And my background in the Marine Corps has probably got more time in Amtrak's than Vic does.
Oh, yes, sir. Yeah. Like I said, after 9/11, we didn't see those for quite some time.
Well, I mean, it's for me, it started out as a platoon commander in a rifle company using AAVs off the well deck of an LST, a landing ship tank, which haven't been in the naval inventory since the early 1990s. At that time, MEUs were 5 ships, not 3.
Nice.
And there was an awful lot of capability there, and gradually that went away. But why did it go away? Why did the number of amphib ships go away? Because we, the Marine Corps, for our own purposes, started changing the definition of how many units, how many battalions go ashore by AAVs, how many go ashore by landing craft air cushion or by LCUs, how many fly ashore by helicopter. That's still an amphibious operation when the heeler-borne assault starts on a ship. And so, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. No, we changed that around, and for very good reasons. And these are requirements-based and budget-based decisions. The United States Navy starts reducing the number of amphibious ships required, to the point where, and you mentioned O-plans earlier, and not getting into anything classified here, but some of the major theater war high-end O-plans are the last requirements placed on the Marine Corps and the Navy for large-scale amphibious operations. They essentially require almost the entire inventory of amphibious ships, landing craft, and the United States Marine Corps, active and reserve component, in order to conduct that size of amphibious operation as part of a joint forcible entry operation against a near-peer nuclear-armed adversary on a peninsula. So we kind of, shorthand know what that is. But the fact remains that we, the Marine Corps, started moving the goalposts incrementally, and the Navy followed suit. And that finally, I would say, finally manifested itself in kind of the inevitable place it was bound to go on and after the attack on the U.S. Embassy in Benghazi. The fact of the matter is that for a significant period of time prior to 9/11, there was a semi-permanent presence of a Marine Expeditionary Unit in the Mediterranean Sea. Why is it there? Not to pull great liberty in south of France or Italy, not just to conduct training exercises with NATO partners and other partner nations in and around the Mediterranean. It was there as the crisis response force in the event one of our embassies or other U.S. interests in a very dynamic and challenging part of the world required reinforcement, evacuation, etc. There was no MEU in the Mediterranean when Benghazi occurred. The forces that were assigned that mission were conducting training in another part of the theater too far away to be of a relevant response. There were Navy surface combatants operating in the Mediterranean that were able to respond in time. However, they don't have a landing force. All they can do is shoot things from the sea. Not entirely a useless capability, but not appropriate to what occurred. And then it took time to get special operations forces and aircraft on station that could actually influence what was going on at the embassy. That's a Marine mission. That's a MEU mission. It's one of the tasks that every MEU trains for. The problem is there was no MEU in the Mediterranean at that point, largely driven by the paucity of available amphibious ships for both operations and training. So you can't have everything everywhere. Everything goes to where the fight is, and at the time the fight is in the North Arabian Gulf, Iraq, Afghanistan, Horn of Africa. So the response of the Marine Corps, again, relevance and the expeditionary nature, is to create this thing that we have now called Special Purpose Marine Air-Ground Task Forces for Crisis Response. What they are, in a lot of ways, are elements of a MEU, a Marine Expeditionary Unit, that have been deployed and shore-based somewhere for extended periods of time, utilizing U.S. bases in foreign countries.
That can quickly aggregate.
Correct. Or operate independently. They have. There are plans to aggregate them. To my knowledge, they have never actually aggregated for anything above a reinforced company level exercise or operation. But they're also limited by their dependence on tactical aircraft. So the MV-22 Osprey provides an incredible capability in terms of reach, if and only if it has access to strategic or operational refueling assets to go further and farther. And it does not carry a large ground combat element footprint, not even an entire formation of them. So again, there's dependence passed into the Joint Force for greater operational mobility from Air Force aircraft. Again, this boils down around to the Navy's part of amphibious operations and that capability and the lack thereof. The follow-on, and here's where I say the current environment really kicks into gear. So the other thing that went on during this entire period of really from the end of the Vietnam War up through the present day is the United States military, started to optimize our standoff capabilities. Large platforms, large amphibious ships, aircraft carriers, to a lesser degree submarines, air bases, unit capabilities, ground bases outside of the old European theater to create concentrations of combat power that we can then deploy into a crisis area. Or what we've done in doing that, or what we did in doing that from the enemy perspective, is self-optimized targets. Right? We created large concentrations of U.S. personnel and capabilities conveniently packaged for mass destruction by a modern capability in terms of attack technology. So that gets lumped under a term called A2AD, which stands for anti-access and area denial. And those are military tactics and the capabilities that underline them used to prevent, in this case, U.S. forces from gaining access or using access to overseas bases or forward locations. And you'll hear a lot of talk about sea denial, denying sea space to an adversary. In this case, the People's Republic of China's ability to deny the use of sea space to U.S. forces because of their weapons capabilities. They're specifically surface-to-surface attack missiles, so missiles that can reach out over the horizon to destroy one of these self-optimized targets, large seagoing vessels. By the way, they can also influence large concentrations of troops on the ground. And so what the Marine Corps has been doing is with the entire Joint Force, looking at what capabilities now, capital C and small c. So what operations, what types of operations, and then what equipment solutions are required for those operations, what new organizations, training, tactics, etc., are required to operate in that environment where the enemy has the ability to deny you access. The fact is, when you take that out of the equation, your only deterrence, the only way to make an adversary or a competitor or a threat either do something or not do something, rapidly becomes a nuclear deterrent, the highest of high end. So the reason the Cold War worked is because there were two levels below that. There was a very low level of insurgency, counterinsurgency, proxy wars, guerrilla wars. There was also in the middle, nuclear on the bottom, on the high end, proxy wars on the low end. In the middle, there was a robust and capable conventional deterrent. All right, an example being, if we want to look at the Cold War in Europe, there were thousands, actually hundreds of thousands, of U.S. troops based in Europe, all over Germany, in England, in Italy, along with their equipment. And they routinely did exercises and showed stuff around forward-based supplies in Norway for the Marine Corps on what was the northern flank or the left flank of NATO. That was there in the event of conventional war in Europe. But what it really is a deterrent of conventional war in Europe. So now, if you take the ability to establish that sort of deterrence, to put those sorts of capabilities, units, assets in a relevant position respective to your enemy, you lose that form of deterrence. What the Marine Corps and the other services, the Marine Corps in particular, are doing with expeditionary advanced base operations and the capabilities that go along with conducting those operations, with Force Design 2030, which is changing, modifying the Marine Corps in terms of structure and capabilities in order to provide a force capable of doing expeditionary advanced base operations. What the Marine Corps is doing is trying to recreate a conventional deterrent so that it does not immediately default or escalate to nuclear deterrence, and also builds on what we've learned over 20 years about that low end of irregular warfare. And so that's really what EABO is. It's developing everything associated with an operational capability for the Marine Corps, so equipment, organizing, training, that recreates a conventional deterrent that is capable of operating inside, so the term inside force gets thrown around. So the inside force or the stand-in force
yep.
as an counterpoint to a standoff force. And I stand off, I'm far enough away, and my weapons can reach the bad guys, but his can't reach me. That really doesn't exist that much anymore because of the capabilities of those
Because the threat
weapons.
ranges have extended out so far.
Exactly. I mean, there's often a lot of talk about, well, we've got to be able to operate inside the enemy's weapons engagement zone. As we sit here in Quantico, we are inside the enemy's
even
weapons
as we're
engagement zone.
getting set up in Guam, where they're already.
But only at the harder, at the highest end. And so that conventional deterrent capability is what's been lacking, and that's what has to now be recreated. And in terms of its role, the Marine Corps is drawing on its traditional role as that expeditionary force in readiness in order to be the joint forces stand-in force, expeditionary advanced base capable force, as one of their service defining roles. I say one of because often lost sight of is the fact that from the Commandant on down, we have not turned away from the broad range of expeditionary capabilities that may be required by any combatant commander. So we're still doing all those other traditional amphibious and expeditionary roles, but now we're adding another tool to the toolbox, another weapon in the arsenal, and that is a credible capability to operate inside that enemy or threat weapons engagement zone. We're also discovering a lot of the other requirements necessary for that. Some of those requirements are material solutions, new different types of landing craft, new or innovative use of not just amphibious ships, but other maritime sustainment vessels. Again, expanding sort of the definition of what a sea base is.
Survivability issues.
Down to very low level, simple sort of train and educate things. So you may not know this, but for example, right now, officers and NCOs in the assault amphibian MOS are also being trained as small boat coxswains in their
that's
MOS
cool.
producing school. So not only do you know how to use a tracked amphibious vehicle, a wheeled amphibious vehicle in the amphibious combat vehicle, but now also how to pilot a small boat. And the point there being to build that capability of operating in a very distributed manner inside contested maritime space, tactical mobility and the ability to sustain forces become key. And so looking deeper into what's really required in order to operate that way is sort of where the new or more modern definitions of amphibiosity need to go.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that context, sir. I mean, that really, a lot of rabbit trails, I think, present themselves in that, and that's part of the show. So we're going to try to get into some of those things. One of the things I want to try to unpack a little bit now while we got you, sir, is that, so being that if we look at doctrinally or from a definition standpoint, being expeditionary it's not required that you be amphibious.
That's correct.
So then, is being soldiers from the sea enough of a small sea capability that separates us from just being a second army?
That's a great question, and let's talk about another. So you're absolutely right. Not all expeditionary operations, not all expeditionary forces, not all expeditionary capabilities are amphibious. And much of what the Marine Corps does in terms of expeditionary operations does not involve amphibiosity. So what is our special sauce, if you will? And I would say it's another C word. It's not necessarily expeditionary capabilities, which exist throughout the Joint Force. The Air Force has eye-watering expeditionary airfield capabilities.
The Army has L-class shipping.
Absolutely. The Army has more landing craft than the United States Navy. So drive down to Fort Story, down here in the Hampton Roads area, and you can see a lot of them. However, what the Marine Corps has, really from boot camp and officer candidate school on, is expeditionary culture. So it's the organizational culture of the Marine Corps that is I think, and I would, and this is not because we're doing this on 10 November, and this is not a chest thumping Marine infantryman speaking. I'm putting my Joint Force officer hat on, and what the Marine Corps has, wall to wall, at different degrees, is not something that all the other services have in the same volume or quality. And that is an expeditionary mindset,
Nice.
an expeditionary culture. And how do I really define that? And this is an experience-based decision, is that Marines really don't think twice about not having the perfect solution before they execute something operationally. Marines, as a culture, look at use your bumper sticker, doing more with less, doing windows, making those improvise, adapt, and overcome decisions in the heat of the moment, and we train that, and we inculcate that culture from entry-level training on, and it in some ways it is our greatest strength. It also enables one of those things that all Marines love to do, sometimes more than anything else, and that is bitch and moan about life. Boy, if we had the gear that those guys had, or if we had that weapon, or well, where are those guys with that gear and those weapons? They're not here doing any relevant contribution to the mission of this force, this Joint Force commander, or the United States at this point. They're not here yet.
Yep.
You are.
Yeah. How many times are you in country going, "Where's the Army?"
Exactly.
They'll be here in a month.
That's right.
They're coming.
Or
it's
some
gonna
of
take
them
a while.
are. Or some of them are.
Right.
All right. Again, but the entire organization
Because their subculture
Exactly.
is what pushes that.
Exactly. So within the United States Army, and again as a joint force trainer, I learned so much, and I had phenomenal experiences working with many different parts of the United States Army and the other services. And there are parts of the Army that I would tell you are more expeditionary than major parts of the Marine Corps. When you go down to Fort Bragg and you start looking at the 82nd Airborne Division, Division Ready Brigade, those sorts of troops, and it's okay to call them troops, those soldiers down to the fighting hole level have an expeditionary mindset that in many ways outdistances a Marine combat service support formation or a Marine headquarters command and control formation. And frankly, it also outdistances some infantry formations in the Marine Corps who have become kind of inured to a certain way of operating. So getting back to that is critical. As an underpinning for not just EABO and stand-in forces and those sorts of things, but really for the sustained relevance of the Marine Corps. And if we're viewed by the other services often as the most traditional of the armed forces, if there's a tradition that we absolutely have to sustain, it's that expeditionary mindset down to every level, regardless of MOS. It goes hand in hand with the other goal of every Marine or rifleman. The fact that every Marine qualifies with a service rifle on an annual basis and is capable of doing those sorts of what in other services are considered purely infantry or ground combat arms tasks. Yes, Marines, part of that expeditionary mindset. You may be an administrator, a radio operator, a cook, a mechanic, but you can, by God, defend yourself when the time comes. That's part of that expeditionary mindset. There's nobody there to do it for you. You got to do it yourself.
It's like the band becomes what's fixed site security,
right,
on deployment.
Exactly. It touches every part of our culture. It's motor stables and user level maintenance on vehicles. There's nobody else to do this for you. You got to change your own oil.
Yeah.
Right. You got to check your own seals. You got to help the experts with the unskilled labor, like breaking track and doing those things. So you have to get outside your MOS.
Horse saddle, man.
Exactly.
Well, sir, and again, I so appreciate your time because this is so great. But as we're talking now about culture, I'm just going to pull a couple things out here. So MCDP 1 obviously just states that operating forces must be organized to provide forward deployed or rapidly deployable forces capable of conducting expeditionary operations in any environment. This means that in addition to maintaining their unique amphibious capability, operating forces must maintain the capability to deploy by whatever means is appropriate in situation. And then MCDP 1 TAC 0 speaks extensively about Marine Corps amphibiosity and what that means to the joint force. And like you said, these are sort of the to proof text our culture. It's inundated since day one. You step on the footprints, you get your stuff, and then you start diving into this culture of being away from the flagpole and being alone and unafraid for doctrinally 90 days, but for a prolonged period of time. That being said, then, as we start looking forward and we start looking at the new operational vision of our senior leadership, has technology, in particular space, made being amphibious obsolete?
It's certainly, again, because of the threat and the challenges that impinge on access and the ability of an amphibious force, or really any expeditionary force, to once again go back to those definitions. Seize and hold in the face of opposition, military invasion. All right, the domain of space quote unquote the ultimate high ground, to quote our Space Force, our guardians. That creates another dimension of threat against any forces operating in any of the other domains. When you then also tie the linkages between space assets, so things in the space domain, with capabilities in the cyber domain, so space-based cyber operations, you compound those threats and you compound those challenges for a force operating in any other domain that much more. So, there are entire families of capabilities that exist and are being developed to fight in that domain, to ensure access in that domain, and control/denial. Think sea control, sea denial,
Sure.
space control, space denial, in order to reduce the challenges for forces and the threat to forces operating in all the other domains.
So you would say then that it is a capability, a cyber landing force is a capability that augments the physical landing force, vice replacing it.
I think that's a good way to put it.
Okay.
Yes, I think that's a good way to put it. I wouldn't. I like the term cyber landing force, but recognizing that there's at least kind of three different parts to that. Mm-hmm. There's the hardware on which cyberspace resides. There's the software, programs, and applications that make up the capabilities in cyberspace. And then there's the wetware, the human beings, the eaters, sleepers, and air breathers who are also part of cyberspace and are the operators of that system. Together, that all sort of makes, so my concern about the cyber landing force phrase is it sort of devolves to
It
people.
one-dimensionalizes
Right? It's
it.
way more than the people.
More than boots on the ground.
Yep. And when you start looking at the capabilities of not just high-end artificial intelligence or machine learning, but simple things that we all kind of deal with now on a daily basis, botnets, verification of access and who's actually doing what.
Right.
Conducting offensive and defensive cyberspace operations for any military force is a key enabler to ensuring the effectiveness of operations in all the other domains.
Right.
Think of it, and again, this was very much the model of phasing joint operations back in the 1990s and early 2000s. So, phase 0 of an operation was diplomatic and other intelligence-related activities, heavy outside the DoD or the Joint Force contribution. And phase 1, at some point in that very linear approach to operations, involved the establishment of air superiority,
Shaping.
localized air supremacy, sea superiority, localized sea supremacy, before any land forces start getting committed. We're going to create a quote-unquote sanitized environment in the air and at sea in order to permit the reception, staging, onward movement, and integration of ground forces. Now you have to expand that phase 1 shaping operations to include the space and cyber domains. And so the required capabilities and forces now expands.
And the timelines, because that's
Absolutely
easy.
And this is an important thing to remember, often lost in academic and training environments. That shaping and that access or sanitized environment in the air and sea was never going to be perfect. It was always going to be permissive to a point, but there was a threat. And actions had to be taken. Forces had to be dedicated to maintaining that superiority. Same goes for space and cyber now.
Yeah.
It's never going to be perfect. There are going to be threats out there. That means there is risk to the force and risk to the mission. So where is the acceptability line? Up to that point, there is too much risk. We cannot continue or start that next phase of, major ground operations or, large-scale special operations. But there's a line there, and at a point, commanders have to accept risk in those other domains.
Yeah, it's not going to be neat. It's
Yeah.
not going to be a neat.
We've had the
every time.
benefit essentially of not fighting a peer adversary in the air or at sea since the Korean War, since the 1950s. There has been nobody that we've actually been fighting with even close to our capabilities. Therefore, making assumptions about risk in the air, sea, cyberspace domains, easy. No, we don't have to worry about that.
No.
We'll
Bring your cami nets for shade.
We'll establish superiority and everything will be fine. One leaker changes that in the air domain. One a small boat or submarine threat or mine threat changes that in the maritime domain. Same in space and cyber.
One bot.
That's right. One virus.
All right. Well, I feel like that is a pretty good spot to start wrapping it down.
Great intro. Absolutely.
We covered a lot of ground. We can go ahead
And air and sea space.
see space.
But we're taking ground.
No,
We are
and
taking-
cyberspace and space.
Yeah,
space.
we have established a lodgement.
Yes.
We are. We're making our landings around
Yeah, now we're ready for
the,
follow-on forces.
the topic. Yeah. So we'd love to have you back on, Woody. If you want to get back into anything that we've touched on today. I say touched on very sarcastically because touching on it with you is sticking your finger deep into the wound. Like it's not a surface level
No.
anything. So we really appreciate having you on. We are recording this, yes, on the birthday of the Marines. You're not going to hear it. This isn't airing for 2 weeks, but we do have to go cut cake.
Yes, we do.
Yep.
So I'm Nick. This is Vic, Will, and special guest Woody, chief editor of Gazette. I guess these are both your employees here. I'm surrounded by gazetteers.
Yeah. So we were very cordial today.
Yeah.
Yes.
So with that, let's just wrap it up. We'll catch you guys later.
Thank you.
Thanks. Great.